I'm willing and have been willing all along to risk everything that I have to provide that service, and we're going to provide it come heck or high water.
Let me tell you a story. It's a story of how we got to now. But this isn't just any story. It's really a saga. It's a modern-day David and Goliath tale where a local folk hero, dismissed and mocked by the establishment, takes on the elites. And every time it seems like he's down for the count, he comes back, bigger and stronger than ever. It's a story of defying the odds, ignoring committees and groupthink, and charging forward with tenacity, grit, and sheer perseverance. In this story, we'll trace through the history of modern media, from broadcast television to cable to the internet. We'll move from wired to satellite, shrinking time and space for good. It's a story of sports ownership, sports rights, and bringing games out of the stadium and into living rooms across the country. It's the story of how the news went 24/7 and how the networks ruled until they didn't. It's a story of Hollywood, film libraries, free agency, Reaganomics, junk bonds, leveraged buyouts, mergers and acquisitions, bailouts, rescues, fame, democracy, free speech, pro wrestling, icons, idiots, heroes, villains, cowboys, mavericks. But first, it's 1963, a year where everything from the news to politics to communications and even popular culture changed forever. As 1963 begins, the national news is broadcast by the big three networks, ABC, CBS, and NBC, as a nightly 15-minute show that highlights the most important news of the day. Each network's anchor essentially reads headlines for national newspapers and wire services. Photos, graphics, and video packages are a rare sight. Now, it's only been a few months since President Kennedy resolved the Cuban Missile Crisis, thanks in large part to his leadership and strong resolve, as well as help from his friends in the budding TV news industry who were happy to share the president's message to the American people. At the same time, 3,459 miles away in the United Kingdom, Beatlemania is running wild, where it would soon cross the pond in February 1964, changing popular culture for good. Enter September 1963. Now, for a number of reasons we'll soon discuss, each of the broadcast networks doubles the amount of time dedicated to their nightly news, going from 15 minutes to 30 minutes each day, effectively signaling to Americans that news is more important than ever. The television news revolution has arrived. Debuting on CBS on Labor Day 1963 with a live news report from Saigon, courtesy of groundbreaking satellite technology, and an exclusive interview with President Kennedy, Americans saw the new news, one more in-depth and global in focus. Just 2 months later, on November 22nd, 1963, the President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, was assassinated, fundamentally altering the course of American history, full stop. 2 days later, a mourning nation watches as his killer, Lee Harvey Oswald, is shot and killed on live TV. Now, any lingering debate over the extended length of the network news is rendered mute. It is over. Americans wanted, no, needed more news. Amidst these events, the advent of the satellite, while still extremely limited, unlocked a new ability to broadcast events from around the world in real time, marking a turning point in how we experience news and live events. Remember, before this, newspapers were being published a few times a day, and radio was the best place for live coverage. You see, radio was live, but live television was game-changing. Suddenly, our vast world felt much smaller. Now, with today's instant access to worlds far away, it's really hard to grasp just how big of a shift this was. But if I may, 1963 feels like that line in Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises, where everything happens slowly, then all at once. It was a year where the world started in one place and ended in a completely different one. A match had been struck, and as news, politics, culture, and technology were each rapidly changing, a young man's life was upended in a way that would fundamentally change the course of the world. Just nobody knew that yet. On March 5th, 1963, Ted Turner, a hard-charging 24-year-old Southerner working for his father's Billboard advertising company, got a phone call that his world had changed forever. His father, Ed Turner, boss, hero, and so much more, was dead. He had killed himself. It was the pivotal moment that ultimately set Ted Turner on a path to change the world. This is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga.
When the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
What we're doing right here on this spot is the greatest advance in television since television was invented.
They're risk takers, rule breakers, and empire builders. These are the stories of the visionaries who transform media forever.
Whatever I have is being put at risk on this project, and if it's not successful, I'll be looking for a job.
Going to Bernard Shaw.
Tear down this wall.
From High Bar, this is Media Moguls.
We won't be signing off until the world ends. We'll be on, we will cover it live.
Hello and welcome to Media Moguls. I'm Web Barr. I'm the founder and CEO of High Bar, and I'm the host of this show, Media Moguls. Over the last 16 years, I've worked in media and entertainment as a founder, executive producer, designer, operator, and more. I've worked at institutions like National Geographic Magazine, upstarts like Bleacher Report, startups like Meet Cute, and now I'm the CEO and founder of my own company. We're focused on the history of popular culture from 1960 to 2010. These are things that are traditionally underappreciated or looked down on by academics in schools where they're teaching politics and war. But if you bring up the Beatles, you're likely to see your professor roll their eyes. But the Beatles are pretty freaking important. As someone who's worked in media my entire life, I've always been obsessed with the history of our industry. And in all my years working in media, it's always surprised me just how little of the industry's history is taught or even discussed. Media Moguls is here to help fill in that gap because we believe that the history matters. And while it doesn't necessarily repeat itself, it sure as hell rhymes. Listen, I think we've done a pretty bad job teaching the history of modern industry, companies, and important people. Not just in media, but across the board. Think about it. Students know more about someone like Henry VIII or Oliver Cromwell than Ted Turner or even Steve Jobs. Still, Media Moguls isn't just about the accomplishments of these larger-than-life figures. That's not enough for me, and it shouldn't be enough for you. Instead, we're going to tell the story of how we got to now, one media mogul at a time. This show is the result of over a year and a half of research, deep conversations, countless scripts, drafts, and a lifetime of passion. More than 30 books went into the research for this season alone. So I'd like for you to think of Media Moguls kind of like Hardcore History or even Acquired, shows with extremely high bars to reach. But we're going to try our best to reach that bar because these stories matter, these people matter, and the lessons from them are even more important. Similar to how studying Warren Buffett's life can actually lead to better investing, I believe that studying people like Ted Turner, Steve Ross, Walt Disney, Jeffrey Katzenberg, the history of Disney, Paramount, etc., will shape how you think. Because, trust me, they're all really fascinating, and you can learn so much from them, both the good and the bad. Still, in my opinion, there's no one better to start with than Ted Turner. This is the story of a cable pioneer, a TV innovator, a satellite visionary, professional sports owner, sports broadcasting and TV rights trailblazer, America's Cup champion, Sports Illustrated cover boy, founder of CNN, acquirer of MGM, proud owner and programmer of TBS, TNT, Cartoon Network, and lest I forget, WCW. I'm going to share this season stories of M&A dreams and nightmares, big wins, massive failures, and amazing recoveries, all while telling you how we got to now. In a world before the 24/7 news cycle, one that Ted would actually create, he consistently defied logic on land and gravity at sea by going with his gut and studied intuition. When Ted Turner went in, he went all in. He lived by his father's motto, lead, follow, or get out of the way. He's the kind of person that didn't do things one way just because that's the way they'd always been done. Ted's success came from going against the grain, ignoring the consensus, and while luck played a part, so did he. In a world without A/B testing, analytics, easy financing, or modern venture capital, Ted Turner bet it all. And then he bet it all again. Ted Turner wasn't just a person, but also an idea. This embodiment of the maverick spirit, a modern-day gunslinger in a world full of pocket protectors. A showman, but really the everyman. A folk hero who embodied the American dream. Ted's story is really the kind that the greatest novelists in the world wouldn't believe if it weren't true. Now, you probably remember Apple's iconic 1998 Think Different campaign. You know, the one where Steve says, "Here's to the crazy ones, the square pegs in the round holes." And it has imagery of Jim Henson, Miles Davis, Martha Graham, Pablo Picasso, Muhammad Ali, and Ted Turner, while he was still working and operating. Well, Ted was no doubt a square peg in a round hole, as he took on new ventures with boundless optimism, energy, and tenacity, no matter the odds. And while the establishment laughed at his audacious plans, they weren't laughing for long. Now, if you're like me, you probably like to read a lot of books, listen to a lot of podcasts, and let's be honest, the biographies where the author spends 100 pages discussing someone's childhood, and then you get to 120 and you're like, why did I just read all that stuff? It's a complete waste of my time. Well, in most cases, that's absolutely true. But with Ted Turner, and most media moguls for that matter, their childhoods and relationships with their parents are instrumental. You see, they set the stage for future successes and ultimately their media empires. And as much as I'd like to just skip over Ted's childhood and get right to TBS or CNN, it's essential to understanding him and his story. Like Ted's childhood hero, Alexander the Great, we need to begin with his own Philip II, his father, Ed Turner. The origin story of a media mogul is rarely, if ever, self-made. Instead, it's one where a man must overcome his father's expectations before forging his own path forward. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Robert Edward Turner III, better known as Ted Turner, was born on November 19, 1938, in Cincinnati, Ohio, to Ed and Florence Turner. His father, Ed Turner, was a salesman with a three-pronged dream. 1, become a millionaire. 2, have a yacht. And 3, own a plantation. By the age of 50, he'd achieved all three. Just a few years later, Ed Turner was dead. Ted believed his father's incredible success, achieving all of his lifelong goals by the age of 50, is what ultimately killed him. And not just that, it's because he didn't set his goals higher. Now, a recurring theme at David Senra's excellent Founders podcast is how many successful entrepreneurs carry these major chips on their shoulder because of issues with their father. But as the saying goes, chips on shoulders put chips in pockets, right? Still, for Ted Turner, it was both his drive and fuel for success. Now, I'll get to that in a minute, but first, we got to talk about who Ed Turner was and how'd he get into billboard advertising, where he coined one of Ted's favorite phrases: early to bed, early to rise, work like hell, and advertise. Well, Ed Turner got his start in advertising as a human car counter. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, what in the heck is a human car counter? Well, it sounds exactly what it was. Ed Turner's job was to stand on the highway and count cars passing specific billboards and just measure how many cars saw those ads. It was a simple but important way to figure out how many people saw a company's ads. So think of it like a human version of Google Analytics 70 years before Google. In 1941, 3 years after Ted was born, his sister Mary Jane came into the world. And soon after, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Ed Turner enlisted in the Navy and moved his family from Cincinnati to the Gulf port. That is, he moved everyone but Ted. No, Ted had to stay in Cincinnati with his grandmother, where they enrolled him in a boarding school as a 4-year-old. Now, just imagine, it's the middle of this gigantic war, and you're left behind at the age of 4. That's the kind of thing that doesn't just leave a scratch. No, it leaves permanent scars. Once the war ended, Ed Turner returned to Cincinnati and opened Turner Advertising across the river in Covington, Kentucky, where he threw his billboards up outside of the new airport. It was a really smart idea, right? Well, business initially boomed until competitors followed his lead and crowded the market. He knew he needed to get out of Cincinnati and move somewhere where he'd have better growth opportunities. So in 1947, Ed Turner moved his business to Savannah, Georgia, where there were better opportunities and less competition. If abandoning his son during World War II wasn't enough, once Ted reached 4th grade, he was sent to Georgia Military Academy, which honestly sounds like my version of hell. At Georgia Military Academy, Ted wasn't the Southerner everyone associates him with today. No, he was a Yankee from Cincinnati, and as the youngest boarding student at the school, which would be repeated later, he was subject to beatings from other kids who'd yell, "Kill the Yankee bastard!" Hardly ideal, but what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Well, perhaps. So it's no surprise that Ted became known for being his own man as he aged, hating committees, going on his gut and intuition. But if you really want a blueprint for developing an outsider, this is it. In Ted's autobiography, Call Me Ted, he describes his father as, quote, a conservative man in every way. At the height of the Cold War, he used to tell me the commies were going to defeat the United States and would shoot everyone who had more than $50. For years, I never walked around with more than $49 in my wallet, end quote. Now, that's the kind of person we're dealing with when I talk about Ed Turner's influence on Ted. Ted's a lot more of an optimistic guy. It doesn't seem like Ed was the same. It's generational. He was coming out of the Great Depression. He's the no-nonsense, no-hugging type. And we all know that kind of person, but it's not ideal when you're sent to boarding school at such a young age. And yet, while he was more of the pessimistic guy, he was also a dreamer who one day hoped that Ted would be able to work with him. Throughout Ted's childhood, Turner Advertising grew pretty fast. They got virtual monopolies in Savannah, Macon, Columbus, and Charleston, becoming one of the biggest outdoor advertising companies in the South, aka billboard companies. But the cost of that growth was steep, and not just financially. I'm talking about Ed Turner's health. He was pushing himself to the brink, working 18-hour days, booze, womanizing, and more. You see, owning a growing billboard business meant you weren't home very often. No, you were outside, driving town to town, meeting and greeting all the time. And of course, you were selling, and selling. That was the name of the game. But it was also a lifestyle. It was a lifestyle that wreaked havoc on his family whenever he was home, marked by his alcoholism and both physical and mental abuse. The bearer of that abuse? Ted. Now, the abuse on Ted Turner was devastating. His mother explained, quote, Teddy was a little on the mischievous side, but he was never really bad. His father just ruled with an iron hand. 90% of the arguments I had with Ed were over his beating Ted too hard, end quote.
The freeway has
My
a
God.
divider strip in the center. with
Ted
several
later
lanes for
shared
traffic in
painful
two
memories of how his
directions.
father, instead of beating him, would make
Separate
Ted
ramps are used
beat
for
him.
entering and leaving the
Quote,
freeway.
he laid down on the bed and gave me a razor
The
strap
point
and he
where
said,
two or more
hit me
freeways
harder.
cross is an
And that
interchange.
hurt me more
It
than
might
getting
have
beat
4
myself.
levels,
I couldn't do it. I
but
just
most
broke
are
down and cried.
one-level separations.
It was the most painful
As you
thing
will
I
see,
ever did in
interchange
my
traffic
entire
requires
life.
Special driving
End quote.
procedures.
There's a lot more stories
These
like
new
this,
superhighways present
but I'm
many
not going to say
problems
any
for the
more. I
motorist.
think you just get the
Automobiles
picture.
are moving at
These
high
kinds of
speeds.
things
Often the traffic is very heavy.
really leave a mark
Thousands
on
of
the
cars
psyche
use
of a
the
child.
freeways every day.
Now,
Any
it
vehicle can make a
actually
sudden,
reminds me of how
dangerous
historian
move at any
Andrew
time.
Roberts described Winston Churchill's relationship with his father in his book, Leadership in War.
Motorists must learn
Quote,
to think and
Churchill
plan
received
ahead.
little that was commendable or worthwhile from his father, who despised him and
Superhighway can be
undercut
very
him at every
confusing.
opportunity.
Plan your entire
Indeed, the more his father was aloof and disdainful
Never
toward him,
drive your car
the more
on any
Churchill seems to
superhighway
have
when the
worshipped
vehicle
him.
has worn-out
Lord
tires,
Randolph's
bad
only
brakes,
other
or
service to his
mechanical
son
problems.
was to die at the
Dangers
age
are
of 45 when
multiplied at
Churchill
high
was only
speeds.
20,
Your car might
allowing
stop
him
running.
to
You
escape
might
the
have an accident.
stultifying
Be
influence
certain that your
of this
car is in top
mercurial,
condition.
quick-witted,
Then you are
intellectually
at it
brilliant,
at a time. Don't try to
unstable,
jump across
controlling,
several in a
and
single
at
move.
times deeply
It is safer to
unpleasant
drive
man.
with the prevailing speed
In
on
a
the
sense, Winston
highway.
Churchill was striving
But if
to
you must
impress the
drive slower,
shade
stay
of
in the
his missing
right-hand
father
lane.
all
Don't
his life,
block traffic.
despite having received a little
Allow at
from
least
him,
one
but
car lane for
irritation
every 10
and
miles
occasionally
on your
contempt.
speedometer.
End
When
quote.
you're moving at 60
Get the
miles an
picture?
hour, it
They are
takes the
similar,
distance
right?
of half a
But
city
what
block to
doesn't
stop.
kill you
You're in
makes
danger
you
if
stronger?
assume the car you follow will
Perhaps.
move between your car
Now,
and the one
by
in
the time
front.
Ted was
You'll
12,
need that space if
while
he
most
meets an
kids were spending their
emergency or
summer
makes a mistake.
vacations outside playing
You don't
baseball with their
save time
friends
by
like they do in the
riding
movie
on
The
top of the
Sandlot,
next car.
it's the 50s, so that's
If
the kind of
slower
thing that
moving
was
car
happening.
would stay in the
You would
right-hand
expect Ted to be doing the same
accident
kind of
hazards
thing.
like this one
Nope.
might be avoided.
Ted was put to work by his father. And being the boss's
And
son
now
didn't
you're at the
exempt him from
interchange.
anything.
Curves
He was
and
tasked
heavy
with painting
traffic call
billboards,
for special
digging holes,
precautions.
and mowing the grass
Signs
around
like this
billboard
one
sites.
indicate the lane you
For
want
his
to take.
40-hour work
Look for
week
these
in the deep
markers
South
before you
summer
arrive
heat,
at the
Ted made
interchange.
$50
If
a
you
month.
need- law
But here's the
enforcement
kicker.
officers have 3
Ed Turner
warnings for every
charged his
motorist,
own
regardless
son
of driving experience.
$25 per
Each of
month
these warnings
for
should
room
be
and board
observed
that
for
summer.
better driving and to
Ed
prevent
Turner
accidents.
justified it, saying, quote, well, if you can do
First,
better,
never
you're more than
stop
welcome
your
to try,
car on the
end quote.
freeway.
That's not
And
just
never
tough
get
love,
out
that's
of your
just
car
duh.
in a lane of traffic.
Ted dealt with his father's
If your
tough
car
love
has
as
a
best he
flat
could,
tire, stalls,
later
or
describing
develops
those
other
summer days
trouble,
as,
stay
quote,
inside and
fun.
bring it to the
Getting up
extreme
at
right.
5 in the morning to get out and install a new sign before the
Your
traffic
life
gets
is
started,
worth more
and
than a
painting
tire.
billboards, you're Michelangelo in the Sistine
Save
Chapel,
yourself
except
before
that you
you
don't have
save
to
your
work
car.
lying on your back, end quote. While Ted didn't have to paint the billboards upside
And
down while
exit
losing
your
his
car
sight like
on the
Michelangelo,
right-hand side.
he did have to work in the Deep South's brutal summer heat,
Second,
spending
never
long
drive
days
if
in
you are
swamps filled with
tired.
poisonous
If your
snakes.
eyes
I'm
close
sure there
for
are
just a
alligators,
fraction of a second,
and
you're
the
in
entire
immediate
time he was
danger.
not allowed to complain
Park
about it
your
once.
car and rest.
I imagine this is when Ted really realized that
Third, keep your
not only
mind
did he
on
have
your
the
driving and not
capacity
on other
for hard
matters.
work,
Watch the
but that he
vehicles in
actually
front of you on
enjoyed
the
it.
freeway, and
And
remember
his
the
hope
cars
was
behind
always
you,
that
too.
the harder
Check
he
your
worked,
rearview mirror
the
frequently.
more his
Look out
father
for
would
sudden
notice.
stops,
With
and
the
be
benefit
ready
of
for any
hindsight, it's
emergency.
pretty obvious
You'll
that
meet many
starting
of
boarding
them in
school
your
as a
freeway
4-year-old and then going to a
safely.
military
That's
school
another
for
reason
4th
for
grade
planning your route before
would
you
have
begin the trip.
a major impact on
And you
anyone's
must maintain a
childhood.
much slower
Combine
speed.
that with the volatile atmosphere back home, and I mean, it's a miracle
Remember the
Ted
freeway
made it out
tips
at all.
expert drivers
So
practice
yeah,
all the
Ted
time.
didn't have a Leave It to Beaver
The
childhood.
multi-million-dollar
In
freeway
fact,
systems
his
help you
childhood was
travel
crazy
rapidly and
compared to
safely,
most.
Usually.
But for Ed Turner,
But try to avoid
unrealized
traffic jams
potential
like this.
was
If
the
you see a
same
tie
as
up ahead
failure,
or hear a
and he
radio
wouldn't
bulletin,
tolerate it
if
with Ted.
possible, turn off and use an
Now,
alternate street.
Ted over the years continued to
Freeway
romanticize
driving
his
calls
father's
for
tough
excellent
love,
drivers and
even
excellent
years
cars,
after his
each
father's
of them in
suicide,
the best
saying,
condition.
quote,
There are
he
lots
thought
of
that
rules
people
and
who were
regulations
insecure
to
worked
remember.
harder,
That's
and I
true.
think that's probably
You
true.
must discipline
I don't
yourself
think
to
that
follow
I've
the
ever
proper
met a
procedures
super
and
achiever
form
who
good
wasn't
driving
insecure
habits.
to some
It
degree.
isn't a snap
A
to
super
drive on
achiever
the
is somebody
turnpikes,
that's never
parkways,
satisfied.
expressways, and
End quote.
freeways. And not
He
every
added that his
motorist can
father's
do it
Spartan
well.
regimen made me tough.
You pay for
To
your
me, this
mistakes,
sounds very
one
Kobe
way or
Bryant-esque.
another.
It reminds me of Kobe's love for his
But
favorite
there's no
movie,
reason-
Damien Chazelle's Whiplash, about the pursuit of excellence no matter what. But the difference is, in both Kobe's life and in Whiplash, the protagonist got to make the choice of whether or not to adopt that Spartan mentality, or in Kobe's case, Mamba mentality. Ted Turner never had a choice. No, ultimately, Ed Turner built the warrior. At this point in our episode, I'm going to walk through some of what was happening in the television space at the time. But first, a quick heads up. Each episode, I'm going to go into what was happening in related industries at the time. Why? Because, like Lester Freeman says on The Wire, all the pieces matter. So in episode 2, for example, I'll cover the early days of cable. Not because Ted Turner was personally wiring cable on top of the Allegheny Mountains. He was not. But because all the pieces matter and it's necessary context, not just for upcoming episodes in Ted's story, but for future seasons of Media Moguls. So just keep that in mind when I discuss network TV. And while I'd love to discuss RCA's radios and how they evolved into NBC and later ABC, or talk at length about CBS's Bill Paley, those are stories for another day and another season. For now, I'm going to focus on the early days of TV in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, as well as the early 60s. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So, television begins its story in 1939, just 1 year after Ted was born, when it made its public debut at the World's Fair in Queens, New York City. The World's Fair is, of course, a well-known event that prior to doing this podcast, I had no clue what actually happened at a World's Fair. But think of it like an Epcot-like international affair with pavilions aimed to promote global unity and America's belief in extending freedom to all, even Japan and Germany. The slogan that year captured the spirit, a dawn of the new day. Remember, Europe was on the brink of war at this point. Still, the 1939 World Fair drew a record 44 million visitors, including the King and Queen of England, who brought with them a rare copy of the Magna Carta. But the World's Fair is also a place where innovative technology was often introduced as well. For example, General Electric debuted the first fluorescent light bulb at that same fair. The real star of the 1939 World's Fair was RCA's first television set, complete with wood paneling and a 7-inch picture tube. Just imagine what the potential 44 million people who could have seen this were thinking when they saw the television set. It was radio transformed into moving pictures. It's incredible to think about. Like many technological advancements, television was built on the foundation of an earlier medium, radio. TV was the natural next step after radio, and it featured programming from the networks, CBS, NBC, and is soon to launch, ABC. Interest in television soared after its debut at the World's Fair. Unfortunately, the outbreak of World War II put everything on hold until after the war. By 1948, TV really started to take off, and it did so using a system nearly identical to radio, where the networks, which were NBC, CBS, and ABC, supplied national programming to their respective local affiliate stations, just like they did in radio. You see, that's how these things actually evolve. It's not by starting over from scratch with each new medium, but by keeping the systems and protocols in place while evolving the technology and further entrenching the incumbents. That's one of the other byproducts. It's a point made often in Derek Thompson's excellent book, Hitmakers, where he uses an acronym for it called MAYA, Most Advanced Yet Acceptable, to describe the strategy of keeping systems familiar while improving the underlying technology. It perfectly describes what the network television strategy was. Use the same distribution system as radio for TV, which had served them really well for over 2 decades. Why reinvent the wheel for television when radio's system was already a winner? One that was already proven to make both the national networks and their affiliates a lot of money. And not only that, by keeping the system nearly the same for television, they made it nearly impossible for new entrants to compete. The barriers to entry were just too high. The network's philosophy was, let's keep it that way. Anyways, in 1948, after issuing around 100 licenses for new TV stations, the FCC suddenly stopped, citing interference problems that needed to be studied. Very governmental, right? Later, the FCC cited the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 as another reason for extending their freeze on new TV licenses. Of course, these measures stopped all growth in terms of television, full stop. Not in terms of sales, but in terms of new stations, and further cemented the dominance of the incumbent networks. The FCC's freeze on new licenses ultimately lasted around 3.5 years. During this period, from 1948 to 1952, it was a very strange time for TV and for Americans. Why? Well, because of the freeze, the government unintentionally created a country of haves and have-nots, where some cities were living in the future of television, while others lived as if TV never arrived and did not even exist. Parts of the country that you'd expect to have TV, like New York City and LA, each had 7 TV stations. Meanwhile, some cities like Austin, Little Rock, and Portland, Oregon, had no stations at all. Some cities had 1, others had none, all as a result of the FCC's decree to freeze new licenses in 1948. The result of what I'll call television cities is actually this really fascinating and social economic experiment. From 1948 to 1952, TV cities like New York and Los Angeles experienced a television revolution. Cities without it did not. One byproduct of this was that TV cities became incredible areas for testing how things might work on TV. What worked and what didn't? Would advertising work the same way it did on radio? Or would the revolution actually be televised? Other questions emerged, like what side effects would come from TV? Would any? It's kind of like when Jeff Bezos responded to a question some years ago, saying the wrong question to ask is, what's going to change in the next 10 years? The right question is, what's not going to change? So with TV, what is not going to change? It's everything. And in a way, it reminds me of the time between the 2007 debut of the iPhone and then 1 year later when Apple launched the App Store. We already knew the iPhone was a really big deal as a technology, but since it launched without an App Store, we really didn't know how big of a deal it could be. Fast forward a year or so, the App Store launches and unleashes the creative minds of developers and entrepreneurs around the world. Within 5 years, we have Instagram, Uber, Airbnb, and all of these things were possible because of the platform of the iPhone. You see, when TV came around, it was just initially thought to be a visual representation of radio, which, keep in mind, only had been around since the early 1920s. So we're talking 20, 25 years here. Let me share some of the ways that television instantly transformed life in these TV cities from 1948 to 52. First, let's talk about advertising. It didn't take long for advertisers and consumers to notice just how effective TV commercials were. Their ability to show people actually eating cereal or using soap or detergent made their products fly off shelves faster than ever. For consumers, seeing the products on TV was much better than imagining them on the radio. TV commercials let consumers see products in action and then go to the grocery to buy them. Here's an example. Hazel Bishop, a small lipstick maker that in 1950 was doing $50,000 a year in revenue. That's before they started advertising on TV. Flash forward 2 years to 1952, when their sales hit $4.5 million and kept growing. There's even the story of a Cleveland bank in 1954 that ran a commercial on TV offering new depositors a Liberace record of all things, and subsequently got $15 million more in deposits as a result. And that was a local commercial. Imagine on a nationwide scale. So yeah, even in its earliest days, TV advertising was really powerful. These television cities saw a new and immediate economic reality. You see, TV also changed how people viewed movies in cities. Cities like New York and LA, movie theater attendance dropped by 20 to 40%. Meanwhile, in Austin and Little Rock, without television, box office attendance stayed the same. Areas with TV reported more theater closings than ever before. 134 in Southern California, 61 in Massachusetts, 64 in Chicago, and 55 in New York City. These were all because of television. Why leave your house if you can watch great entertainment at home? It's like the whole Netflix argument. TV didn't just impact theaters and TV cities. Take comedian Sid Caesar, who launched his groundbreaking Saturday night variety show, Your Show of Shows, in 1949. Now, it had an unexpected impact on restaurants. Places that used to be packed with diners saw big drops as people decided to stay home and watch the show instead. What else? Jukebox listening and income was down. Taxis were hailed less. Public libraries saw drops in circulation, and even Bob Hope's hugely popular radio show's ratings dropped from a 23.8 in 1949 to 12.7 by 1951. Y'all, that's a 47% drop in listening, and he didn't change one thing about his show. So yeah, television's impact was both immediate and obvious. All right, let's talk about how the news evolved on television in this period. In 1949, there were fewer than 100 TV stations across the country. On these stations, the programming was almost exclusively entertainment. And news? Well, news wasn't a priority at all. In fact, today's national obsession with the news is a fairly recent thing, or at least as recent as something that started 44 years ago can be. You see, a lot of it was fueled by Ted Turner's cable news network, also known as CNN, and its 24/7 news cycle, which began in 1980. I'll get to CNN in a few episodes, but back in the 1940s, news wasn't treated the same way it is today, where news is entertainment. In fact, it was cut and dry and rather boring. You see, in TV's earliest days, the national news was only 15 minutes a day, featuring a well-known anchor like Walter Cronkite reading the day's headlines. You were lucky if you saw a still photo or a map of somewhere. Back then, it didn't make much sense for the networks to have these huge news departments. News gathering and reporting were expensive, and transmitting the news, forget about it, that cost even more. All of that work for just 15 minutes of news each day made no sense, and everyone agreed that the juice just wasn't worth the squeeze. What the networks wanted was entertainment. Neither the networks nor their advertisers wanted the drama or complexity that news coverage inevitably brings. Network executives saw TV dollars coming in and asked themselves, is investing in news really worth it? So they decided to focus on entertainment instead of dealing with the hassle of news on television, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. You see, radio was handling the news just fine. And it wasn't just the messiness that came with news. It was also a matter of scarcity in regards to their limited airtime. The networks only had so many hours in a day to fill with programming, right? Why waste those hours on news, which was a tough sell to advertisers and viewers? In fact, it would take years for TV to really gain enough clout in the network C-suite to go after bigger news stories, and even longer for their news operations to actually start making money. But we don't hear that story these days, do we? We act as if the news has always been making money. Now, it hasn't, but what's really interesting to me is that it wasn't like there was this major internal battle at the networks between executives and journalists over their investment in TV news in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. In fact, both sides thought that newspapers and radio did news better. Why deal with the extra headache, right? For years, the networks wrestled with balancing their commercial interests, aka entertainment, and serving the public good, which was the news. And let me tell you, for many years, the public good lost. Well, that changed in 1954, when ABC's Robert Kintner did the nation a bit of a favor by airing the Army McCarthy hearings. That's Joseph McCarthy, Red Scare kind of stuff. In fact, ABC was the only network to broadcast them. And if the others had, we probably wouldn't be talking about this right now. But it wasn't some altruistic mission on ABC's part. It was simply counter-programming at its best. You see, in 1954, ABC's ratings were so bad compared to CBS and NBC that they figured, why not run the hearings? We have nothing to lose. And they were right. Immediately, viewers saw ABC as a more credible network because of their news coverage, which improved their viewership. From this point on, whenever ratings were down, news was seen as a great lever, a great way to counter-program the competition in a cheaper way, but it was never a given. Still, in the end, entertainment at the networks was king. Some years later, the same guy, Robert Kintner, actually created another news innovation for NBC, who at the time was struggling against CBS's well-oiled news machine in the 1960s. Kintner's eureka moment came when he realized they really needed to inject a lot more excitement into their news coverage. So what did he do? He created breaking news. Of course, his idea of breaking into regularly scheduled programming was almost immediately copied by the other two networks, which isn't very surprising because as much as the networks like to say how different they are from each other and that they offer an alternative to the other two, they're really not. They're very similar, and they've always been that way. Anyways, back to the FCC's freeze on new TV stations from 1948 to 1952. After years of complaints about the freeze keeping a large number of unused reserve stations on the rocks, Broadcast Magazine said another look at the Communications Act in relation to these socialistic reservations, end quote. Now, keep in mind, suggesting that a government office was engaged in socialism in the mid-1950s was a very big deal. By 1952, the FCC's blockade on new TV stations was finally lifted, and almost immediately the TV boom accelerated. By 1956, there were more than 500 TV stations in the country, reaching more than 40 million homes, and 85% of those homes were watching an average of 5 hours of TV a day. By the late 50s, the broadcast networks were bringing in advertisers by the loads and profits by the barrel. Remember, their audiences were tens of millions of people at one given time. There's just 3 networks. They could basically charge whatever the hell they wanted, and advertisers like Procter & Gamble were going to pay. It's amazing what you can do when you have finite choice, finite airtime, and a fast-growing audience addicted to your product. Throw in the advertisers willing to pay whatever it took to grow their products nationwide, and it's no wonder why TV was booming. By 1957, sponsorship brought in more than $1 billion in annual revenue. To say that America was changing fast would be an understatement, but we were also changing the world around us. In addition to advertising, news, and commerce, I'm going to briefly discuss how Hollywood navigated the early days of television. I'll talk more about this in future episodes and seasons. Okay, first, goes without saying, Hollywood was terrified of TV. The studios had major concerns. Like, what if people stopped going to the movies and stayed home instead? Hello, Netflix. That's a pretty scary thought, right? Well, it was, considering the recent 1948 Paramount Decree, which had banned them from owning movie theaters and forced them to abandon their vertically integrated model for a more horizontal, far less predictable approach. It's been said for decades that America's greatest export is Hollywood. I'm sure you've heard that. But have you ever wondered why? Well, let me tell you. And there's a number of reasons, but this is just one of them. You see, TV was the catalyst that pushed Hollywood to create new revenue streams for themselves. And here's how it worked. Now, stop me if that sounds like syndication, because in many ways it was. But the Hollywood studios and networks, to a degree, realized that licensing their TV shows and movies internationally could be very lucrative. So what'd they do? Well, the studios had successful movies or TV shows with enough episodes, which meant they were proven hits. Then they'd license those titles internationally in countries like Australia, Canada, and England at pretty reasonable prices. These prices were much lower than what it would have cost those countries to produce their own shows. And by the time these shows aired abroad, they'd already made money in the United States. Licensing them was this cherry on top. It allowed the studios to earn more, sometimes many times over, on TV shows and movies that often had been made years before. At the time, the Television Program Export Association's John McCarthy explained, quote, "We gave them some series for as little as $1,000 for 1 hour program for all of Australia," end quote. Of course, Hollywood, being the only game in town, had amazing advantages, one of which was pricing power. Take Australia, where over the years, Hollywood distributors raised their prices from $1,000 per hour of programming to $3,000 an hour. And while that might sound steep or even anti-competitive, it was still much cheaper than producing their own shows in Australia, ones that might not be hits, ones that had not been proven out in front of American audiences. You see, if Australia wanted to create their own shows, they'd need to spend up to 10 times more than Hollywood's licensing fees, all without any guarantee that the shows they'd be making domestically would be hits. That's a big risk. So they decided it made more sense to license America's proven movies and TV shows and keep their own audiences happy, which makes a lot of sense, right? The playbook was run all over the world, including Canada in the 50s, where TV shows could be sold for $2,000 per 30-minute episode, a price no Canadian producer could ever compete with, since shows made in Canada were closer to 10 times the cost of importing American shows. Canadian filmmaker Henry Comer said, quote, "You've made it impossible for us to earn a living. By the way, my son thinks he lives in the United States," end quote. Now, over time, countries like England introduced quotas to protect their domestic TV and movie industries to the degree that they could. But when people ask me, why hasn't another country really ever been able to compete with Hollywood? Well, I refer them to this story, but there's also a number of other reasons. History, longevity, talent density, and these kinds of things also apply to other dominant industries in certain areas, like Silicon Valley. But that wasn't it. The studios also saw an opportunity to license and sometimes sell movies from their back catalogs to TV stations across the country. It's worth noting that most of these movies hadn't been seen since their initial theatrical run. So if you saw The Wizard of Oz in 39 or Citizen Kane in 41, chances were you hadn't seen them again since. For the networks and their local affiliates, licensing these already made hit films was a no-brainer, since it lowered their programming costs and boosted their profits. Not only that, it probably made their viewers pretty happy. To me, this is just an obvious massive win-win for the networks, their affiliates, and for Hollywood. When I was researching the rise of TV, I came across so many incredible stories about its early impact. One that really stuck with me was how TV changed politics forever. What really fascinated me was how TV instantly shifted how Americans saw their politicians. Suddenly, it wasn't just about a candidate's platform anymore. It was about their appearance, poise, their demeanor. Were they cool as a cucumber or hot like a tamale? The ability to see politicians live in real time with their sweat, smiles, and body language changed the game completely. The presidential election of 1960 between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon has been talked about a lot in the last couple months, and it's a great example of how these things change so fast. In the first televised debate between JFK and Nixon, millions of Americans watched as Richard Nixon, under the bright, hot TV lights, is literally sweating his face off. It's unbelievable. In contrast, Kennedy came across as young, cool, calm, and collected. The difference to Americans was striking. Not only that, it really hurt Nixon's chance to win the presidency in 1960 in a way that was impossible 10 or 15 years before. Now, if you had listened to the debate on the radio, you wouldn't have noticed anything different. It was business as usual. But on television, seeing was actually believing. And as they say, the camera doesn't lie. That year, JFK gave as much access as possible to the networks, opening presidential press conferences to the networks at a time when newspapers really dominated the White House press corps. Now, JFK really understood the power of this new medium. In my opinion, he understood it way beyond how the news broadcasters understood it at the time. JFK prepared all the time for important TV moments because he knew it was a superpower for Americans to see him. See, Kennedy gets it. Media has always been so skeptical of new formats and new mediums, but he understood that Americans seeing was believing, and the press, they would tell his stories in spades. So, by 1960, broadcasting profits reached $1.268 billion. Ultimately, the decision to expand from 15 minutes of daily news to 30 minutes was driven by the network's growing profits and the launch of the Telstar 1 satellite in 1962 by the government and AT&T for the exclusive use of the networks. Now, I'm going to get much more in depth into the satellite revolution in episode 4, but for now, I'll just say that the satellite gave the networks the ability to beam video around the world, which was completely unprecedented, even though it came at a really expensive cost. But with access to this new technology, which they didn't really use as much as you'd think, combined with their dominance over the airwaves already, the government was subtly signaling, like, hey guys, we want more public service programming from you all. Essentially, it was a quiet threat of antitrust pressure that pushed the networks to double the length of their nightly news. It doesn't seem like such a big idea or such a big deal, right? But it was huge. CBS News executive and 60 Minutes creator Don Hewitt said, quote, "I did not think a half-hour show was such a great idea. I thought we had a good product. People were watching. People didn't want a half hour of local news and then another half hour of national news. It was easy to do a half-hour show. Of course, wasn't it Lord Chesterfield who apologized to someone for writing a long letter because he didn't have the time to write a short one?" End quote. I love that quote. It's so true. To me, what's so interesting is that they're doing this really against their own will. And if you mention this to almost anyone in broadcasting now, they'd be shocked. We don't know the history as well as we should, and it really matters. By 1963, a study said for the first time that the majority of people's main source of news was not radio, nor was it newspapers. It was TV. Now, not everyone in media loved the news. In fact, owners of local affiliates hated it. Preempting their nightly airings of Bonanza or the Beverly Hillbillies for the network's longer national news was, as one NBC affiliate said, quote, "Well, they're ruining it with all this damn news and documentary stuff. We lose audiences every time we have to put that stuff in place of entertainment. Take that nonsense of extending the Huntley-Brinkley program from 15 minutes to a full half hour. That alone costs us over $100,000, end quote. It's pretty amazing when you look at how much the affiliates were making on just one half hour, right? Still, the networks were flush with profits. And in order to meet this new requirement of 30 minutes a day, they expanded, adding bureaus in DC, Chicago, LA, and beyond. Of course, this caused their budgets to grow dramatically. Now, that's a lot about the earliest days of television from 39 to 63. But trust me, we'll get back to the networks and their swelling news department in no time. By 1956, America was entering a new chapter of growth, fueled in large part by President Eisenhower's National Interstate and Defense Highways Act. This sweeping initiative transformed the nation and reshaped how Americans traveled by basically creating all the new highways, I-95, I-75, etc. With these new highways came a boom in billboard advertising, especially in the South, where highways opened the floodgates to a new wave of commercialism. You know, gas stations, fast food, sightseeing, tourism, Sea Rock City, stuff like that. Now, it's at this point that Ted was sent off to McCallie, a military school in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where as a 7th grader, he was yet again the youngest boarding student. And his journey got off to a rough start. Ted admitted, quote, At first, I was just a terrible cadet. I did everything I could to rebel against the system. I was always having animals in my room and stuff like that, and getting into trouble one way or another, and then having to take my punishment like a man. I caused Macaulay to completely review its whole disciplinary system. I had more demerits than anyone in the history of the school, end quote. Despite Ted's disciplinary issues, one of his professors remembered him saying, quote, Ted was a determined youngster. He wanted to prove to people you could sail year-round. We never really had to break ice to go sailing, but Ted did sail in weather where no sane human being would ever set foot in a sailboat, end quote. What struck him was Ted's persistence, adding, quote, when Ted set his mind to something, he always stuck to it until he eventually achieved it or got struck down trying, end quote. It blows my mind that a 7th or 8th grader could make this kind of impression on their professor. Ted's behavior is pretty interesting, not just because he was a reader or a dreamer, but because he's actually a doer. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk, and then he talked some more. Later in life, Ted recalled, quote, as a kid, I was a little bit of an artist and a poet. I painted and sculpted a little, but it was too slow moving for me to really get into. But the whole idea of grand things always turned me on. The grand idea of building the Parthenon, and it was the grand idea to build the pyramids. I'm inspired by the great works of the past and the present. I like all that stuff. End quote. Ted was someone who always questioned everything. Like, why are we doing this? Is this a great idea? How do we do it? Why would we do it? And is it different than how others are doing it? To me, these are the kinds of things that when you read books, you casually nod along. But in the moment, in that room, when you're getting those questions, they kind of drive everyone insane. Of course, these are the very traits that make people super successful. And just as Ted was figuring things out at Macaulay, a tragedy struck his family. His sister, Mary Jane, contracted a terrible disease called systemic lupus erythematosus, which is where the immune system attacks the body's tissues. It's awful. When Ted prayed for her recovery, she prayed to die. After years of misery, she succumbed to her illness and passed away. With his prayers unanswered, Ted swore off religion and instead became obsessed with the classics, where he'd spontaneously recite passages from the Iliad or recount tales from Alexander the Great's conquests. But little did Ted realize that he was already living his own Alexandrian experience. You see, his father was that guy, Philip II. Meanwhile, his classroom habits changed. Ted said, quote, I was interested in one thing, and that was in what you could accomplish if you really tried. So I looked around for guys who had tried, end quote. This really makes sense. Alexander the Great, that's someone who really tried. He passed away, I think he was 32 or 33, but he had conquered the known world. And it really makes sense for Ted to follow his heroes in the classics. But here's my question for you. What could you accomplish if you really tried? I want you to think about it and let me know. Email me or tweet at me at Web Barr or at High Bar Media. I'd love to hear if you had a chance to accomplish your biggest dreams. What would you do and how would you do it? Let me know. Let's see what we can do. Now, by the time college arrived, Ted wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and his father wanted him to go to Harvard so that he could pick the brains of the establishment and use his debate champion skills from Macaulay against the best and the brightest that the Northeast had to offer. Well, Harvard rejected his C average, and the Naval Academy wasn't in Ted's cards either. But it was good enough for Brown, where he joined as a member of the class of 1960, planning to major in classics. At Brown, Ted was an outsider once again, but this time he was the Southerner outsider, not the Yankee bastard he'd been at Georgia Military School as a fourth grader. The 1950s version of Brown is like a collegiate version of the School in the Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams, an all-boys school with strict rules like early curfews and no girls in their dorms and dress code and all that stuff. And while Ted wasn't much of a student, when Ted declared as a classics major, his father predictably lost his mind, and he sent him this long, scathing letter about how he was besmirching the family name and all of those crazy, "you're not doing it right, Dad" tropes. Very Dead Poet Society, right? So what was Ted's response? Well, Ted went to the school newspaper and had it published. Now, I love this. I'm not going to read it right now. You can go online. It's super long, but it's great. Inevitably, Ted caved to his father's demands and changed his major to economics. Later recalling, quote, "When I got into economics, I began running into commie professors who thought everybody ought to work for the government. I was opposed to that and defended the free enterprise system to the extent I almost flunked the course. To me, the capitalism system is still the best way to get things done. What a great system," end quote. I agree, Ted. For Ted, college wasn't about academics. It was more about drinking and chasing women. And can you blame him? He'd been in military school basically since he was in fourth grade. But now that he didn't have that tight constraint and disciplinary environment, it caught up with them. First in 1957, when he was suspended for having a girl in his dorm room. And then upon coming back to school after a 6-month suspension, it didn't take long before he was expelled for breaking the same rule. One classmate later said, quote, "I don't think any of us expected that he would ever amount to much of anything except a loudmouth kid from the South," end quote. But that's why we go to college, right? It's a formative experience. It's where you walk in naive, knowing nothing about the world, and exit as a different person, someone who's grown, someone who's learned. You learn how to interact with new people. You meet new friends. You network. Without that system, you just stay the same. And if you think about it, what did you want to do when you were a college student? Did you know what you wanted to be? Ted admitted that, quote, "My rebellion in college was really rebelling against my father. It wasn't that I didn't love him. He was just so domineering," end quote. While Ed Turner was upset about Ted getting kicked out of Brown, there was a silver lining. He was coming home to join the family billboard business, just as Ed Turner had always dreamed. Eager to earn his father's approval, Ted joined Turner Advertising as a billboard salesman in their Savannah operation, where he quickly proved to be a natural. On sales calls with potential clients, colleagues watched in amazement as Ted would drop to the floor pleading, "I'm a dead man if you don't buy." Gosh, I love that. There's other stories of him jumping on the desk and just almost like a preacher, a wild preacher saying, "I testify." Reports of Ted's progress thrilled his father, who eventually made him GM of their Macon branch. Remember, Ed Turner had big dreams for Ted. Now, in the early 1960s, billboard advertising was a very lucrative business. The upkeep was minimal, labor was largely done by unskilled workers, and the profit margins were impressive. Unlike newspaper ads and TV commercials, which were here today, gone tomorrow, and of course subject to trends, billboard ads could last for years. For their part, Turner Advertising built the billboards and then rented them out to advertisers on a monthly basis, earning approximately 35% profit on each billboard. It's pretty good, right? In 1962, things escalated for Turner Advertising when Ed Turner made a bold move to expand nationally by purchasing General Outdoor Advertising for $4 million alongside his friend Robert Nagley, who ran a similar billboard business in Minneapolis, along with a few others. You see, at the time, General Outdoor was the largest billboard company in the country, but they were poorly managed and bloated. For Ed, this was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance to prove himself as the billboard king and turn his company from a big fish in the small pond into a national powerhouse. The deal they put together was essentially a 1960s version of a leveraged buyout, where they used the acquired company's assets to finance the purchase, meaning the new owners needed enough cash flow to cover the debt. The deal was backed by the assets they were acquiring, along with $750,000 borrowed against Turner Advertising and the sale of their Savannah operation. They were given 5 years to repay the debt, which nobody, and I repeat, nobody expected any issues with. Now, The $4 million deal, which felt huge at the time, was pulled off without Ed Turner spending a dime of his own money. It's a pretty good deal. In return, Ed got his pick of territories, taking General Outdoor Advertising's divisions in Atlanta, Norfolk, Richmond, and Roanoke. These moves made Turner Advertising the market leader in the South and one of the biggest billboard companies in the country. To say this is a coup would probably be an understatement. Now, while the debt didn't concern the other investors, it completely freaked Ed Turner out. Still, as part of the deal, Ted was named GM of the Atlanta division, which was the company's largest. But once the ink was dry on the deal, Ed Turner got to work. He was determined to rid himself of this burden, this debt, irrational or not. So he moved fast, pushing the pace both at Turner Advertising and at home, which meant chain smoking packs of cigarettes, drinking heavily, and more action. Soon, Ed Turner, the manager, became Ed Turner, the micromanager. His relentless drive to push the pace took an immediate toll on Ted, who later said, quote, "The first 6 months or so after the General Outdoor deal, my weight dropped from 180 pounds to 135. I developed a pre-ulcerative condition, and my doctor made me swear off coffee. I'd get so tired and agitated that one of my eyelids developed a twitch," end quote. And Ted's not even the one dealing with the debt. That's his father's debt. Still, while he wasn't part of the deal and lost a ton of weight and was stressed out of his mind, he loved his father's decision to go for it. It was go big or go home. It was the type of bold move that he was taught to make as a kid and raised to embrace. So while Ted was thrilled, his father was not. With operations in Atlanta, Macon, Charleston, Columbus, and Cincinnati, Turner Advertising was throwing off more cash than Ed could ever spend. But he wasn't satisfied. He was stressed. Even with more than enough cash flow to cover the debt, Ed Turner couldn't handle it. And when his friends, advisors, and even his accountant tried to reassure him, he wouldn't listen. He didn't even want to hear it. Ted could see the incredible stress his father was under, but he was powerless to do anything about it. Have you ever tried to tell someone who's stressed, "Don't be stressed"? Doesn't work. Ed's friend and accountant, Erwin Mazzo, who's going to be an important figure in our story, told Ted's biographer, Porter Bibb, quote, "Ed had pulled off a terrific deal with General Outdoor, but I wasn't sure what was coming next," end quote. Just think about that. Not knowing what comes after a big deal or big coup should be exciting, but it's really scary. And it's easy for us to look back with the benefit of hindsight and roll our eyes. It's like, I mean, you made the biggest deal. You're already crushing it. You have cash flow. But just thinking out loud, our ability to make decisions with confidence today in 2024, 25 is so much greater than it was back then. Remember, 1963 was a time where math was being done by hand. We were still 6 years away from landing on the moon, and the British hadn't invaded anything yet. The world just moved a lot slower back then. So I can understand how the mind might play tricks on someone, or how someone might not believe all their yes men telling them that a deal that they've just signed is a slam dunk. In 1963, there were not these amazingly easy ways to accurately track success in real time. We're so lucky today to be able to have stuff like Google Analytics. But back then, you needed a lot of smarts, guts, and cash flow. Sadly, Ed Turner just couldn't see the forest through the trees. And months after closing the deal, he was leaning heavily on booze, cigs, and pills. By January 1963, Ed Turner checked into Silver Hill, a rehab center in Connecticut. Less than 5 months after they acquired General Outdoor, Ed, who was now in rehab, called his business partner, Robert Nagley, in a panic, begging him to buy the divisions for the same amount that he'd paid. Nagley described that Ed was, quote, "terribly upset, not making any sense at all. He told me he was having second thoughts about the properties he had just acquired. I'll never forget what he said. Quote, It's a long way, Bob, from the master bedroom to the cellar, end quote. Now, once Ed Turner left rehab in February 1963, he kept burning the candle at both ends. All the while, his business partners continued reassuring him, everything's okay, Ed. It is okay. We are going to make it. He just wouldn't listen. When he got home, he couldn't shake his depression, telling someone, quote, I don't want to hurt anybody. I just feel like I've lost my guts, end quote. What happened next shocked everyone. In his determination to rid himself of this burden, Ed Turner actually decided to sell the Atlanta division to his business partner, Bob Nagley. He offered it for $1 million, the same amount he'd invested in General Outdoor. Nagley was open to the deal, but only if he'd let him sweeten it by $50,000, so Ed could at least make a small profit for his troubles. Almost immediately, Ed Turner created this false sense of urgency, asking Nagley's reps to come to South Carolina for a meeting. And when they arrived at his home, he had prepared a simple sales agreement and insisted they write a check for $50,000 as a sign of good faith. Of course, these guys were shocked. This was totally out of the norm. Remember, the deal was signed just a few months before. Regardless, they reluctantly did as requested. Even close friends like Erwin Mazzo were stunned. He tried to explain Turner's thinking, saying, quote, he said he'd made a big mistake, one that he was convinced would break him. I told him he was wrong, that this was the best acquisition he had ever made. Ed seemed pretty calm about the whole thing, but nothing he said added up, end quote. Now, Ed Turner really worried about how Ted was going to take the news. After all, Ted figured he was going to run the company one day. It was going to be his. At the same time, Ed didn't want to lose face with his friend, Bob Nagley, by backing out of a deal. You know, old school, honor and respect. And that makes sense too. So the deal moved forward with speed, which of course worried everyone. Especially when Ed Turner told a friend, quote, you're pretty concerned about me, aren't you? You want to put me in a hospital. I guess you think I'm going to kill myself. Well, you don't have to worry. I'm not going to do that, end quote. When Ted finally heard about his father's shocking plan to sell the company, he immediately called him, desperate to change his mind. Ted Turner, debate champion at Macaulay in high school, laid out his case, pointing out that all their offices were exceeding projections, and they still had 5 years to pay off all the debt. He kept his tone optimistic, saying, quote, we can do this. You and me, we can do this together, end quote. But as Ted realized he wasn't getting through, his shock and optimism turned to anger, saying, quote, Dad, all my life you've taught me to work hard and not be a quitter. And now you're the one who's quitting. What's happened to you? How could you do this? End quote. By the end of the call, Ted thought he'd convinced his father not to sell the company. He thought, wrong. Ed Turner moved forward, selling the newly acquired properties back to his friend, Bob Nagley, signaling that this was truly the end of the dream of the Billboard King. What Ted didn't know at the time was his father didn't actually think he could run the business. He was too young, too inexperienced, too everything. But here's my question for you. Is anyone actually really ready? Now, I want you to think about that, because you don't really know you're ready until you sit on the throne. It's a story of HBO's Succession and Game of Thrones, right? Now, to Ted, this was really the ultimate betrayal. It was inconceivable that his father would sell off the company's new crown jewels behind his back without consulting him. In his memoir, Ted remembered, quote, we argued bitterly. I offered to buy the business myself, all of it, including Atlanta, end quote. But Bob Nagley confirmed Ed Turner's thinking, saying, quote, Ed thought Ted was just too young to run the business. And if his son wasn't able to pay him off, Ed visualized losing everything. Their arguments were fierce. Ted called his father cowardly. He thought his father was insulting his intelligence, end quote. And it makes sense why. You see, Ted thought his father believed in him. He thought he'd convinced him not to sell the company's new properties. He thought wrong. And so, on the morning of March 5th, 1963, after eating breakfast with his wife Jane and his best friend Jimmy Brown, Ed Turner got up, smiled, and went upstairs to the bathroom where he took out a .38 caliber pistol and pulled the trigger. The next day, in a very strange coincidence, the Atlanta Constitution ran a story on the front page about proposed legislation to limit the number of billboard ads on Georgia highways. Just a few columns over was an announcement of Ed Turner's death. Now, prior to Ed Turner's death, he told Ted, quote, "Son, you be sure to set your goals so high that you can't possibly accomplish them in one lifetime. That way you'll always have something ahead of you. I made the mistake of setting my own goals too low, and now I'm having a hard time coming up with new ones." End quote. Ted's father's sudden death left him reeling. Not only had he lost his father, but he had also found himself without the billboard empire that he expected to run one day. Now, since Ed Turner spent so much time running the company from South Carolina, or he had been away in stints in rehab, he and Ted had barely discussed the future of the business, let alone succession. And why would they? Ed Turner was only in his early 50s. Succession wasn't anywhere close to urgent. Remember, Ted found out his father had sold the company just a few days before his death. Now, did Ted know how to run the business inside and out? Absolutely. In fact, when his dad was in rehab, Ted was running it. But he wanted more. He wanted to prove himself. But the problem was his father didn't think he was ready. But you're never really ready to do something until you actually do it. I can read a book about playing guitar, but am I ready to play it? No, and that's the smallest example I can think of off the top of my head. But running a company is a very complicated thing. So, after reading his will, a clear message was sent to Ted. Ed Turner didn't believe he was up to the task. Sure, Ted was just 24, but that's not how he was raised. We're talking about Ted Turner here. He was born and raised to say, lead, follow, or get out of the way. It says everything you need to know about Ted, that he could have walked away with more than $1 million inheritance while keeping the rest of his company. But that just wasn't in his DNA. Ted's immediate reaction was as bold and courageous as it was desperate. Ted vowed to save the company his father had sold just 2 days before, or die trying. So, right after the funeral, Ted shared his plan with family friend and accountant Erwin Mazzo. It was nothing short of shocking. You see, Ted was going to get the deal nullified and, if necessary, sue Bob Nagley for taking advantage of his father's state of mind. He even considered blaming it on his father's temporary insanity. By any means necessary, right? Ted explained his mentality, quote, "I was sad, pissed, and determined. I had to get that company back. I knew Mr. Nagley was my father's best friend, and I thought I'd just call him up and it would be fixed." End quote. Now, this was a bit of a naive assessment by Ted, but when he heard Nagley was spending the winter in Palm Springs, he immediately flew out to meet him in person, face to face. That's how business gets done, right? Where Ted boldly said, quote, "Just tear up the purchase agreement and let me keep my father's company. You won't be sorry," end quote. Imagine Bob Nagley's reaction. He said no, but not without thinking just how ridiculous it was that Ed Turner's Playboy son, who was known for gallivanting and going around the world sailing, was trying to make a move on him. In Porter Bibb's biography of Ted Turner, Bibb suggests that Nagley, quote, completely misread the younger Turner's intentions. He felt Ted might be making a grandstand play to see if he could squeeze more money out of Nagley's original and reluctant offer to buy back the Atlanta assets. Since agreeing to Ed's desperate request, Nagley had grown comfortable with the idea of adding Atlanta to his own holdings, so he quickly offered Ted $1.4 million, a whopping 40% premium over the price Ed had paid. Shocked when Ted turned him down on the spot, Nagley promised to keep the offer open for a year in case Ted should run into any difficulties or change his mind, end quote. Now, after failing to convince Nagley to nullify the deal, Ted tried guilt. Quote, how can you take your best friend's business away from him? End quote. And when guilt failed, Ted turned to bold, competitive tactics that erred on the side of dirty. You see, before going to Palm Springs, Ted started transferring leases from Nagley's newly acquired Atlanta operation to Ted's Macon unit. He even threatened to put billboards in front of existing ones. Or if it came to it, he'd torch the Atlanta billboards entirely. Ted described everything, saying, quote, just a little paperwork, we'd say if anyone asked. I delayed as much as I could with Mr. Nagley, so that when they finally came down with the closing documents 2 weeks later, I presented them with a fait accompli. I told them I'd already hired the entire lease department of the company they're supposed to be buying, and I've already jumped the leases. That's when you go out and get a new lease for another company. It's sabotage. If you ever want to steal a franchise, that's how you do it. Boy, did they get back on the telephone to Minneapolis, end quote. Damn. So, like I said, Ted was hell-bent on getting everything back or dying trying. Here's what Ted told a friend. Quote, it was war. He would start another company from scratch in Atlanta just to hurt them. He would build billboards in front of theirs. He would play as dirty as it takes. My father wasn't in his element when he sold out, but I'm in mine, end quote. You see, in order to win, Ted was willing to lose everything. Very few people treat business this way, as a win or die proposition, especially 24-year-olds. But Ted was very comfortable with the risk. He'd been born with it. He was trained on it, sailing around the world in these competitions, which were life or death kind of scenarios as well. Ted recalled Nagley's offer, quote, I'd give them all the leases back and be a nice boy. Or they said, I'd give them $200,000, then they'd release me from the contract. They said I had 30 seconds to decide, but I didn't even take 30 seconds. I said, that's a fair deal. I'll give you the $200,000. Well, they all fell over backwards. They were actually 3 guys involved in the deal, and all 3 of them were in the 90% tax bracket. They only owned the thing for a couple weeks, so it was a real short-term deal. And all the $200,000 would have been ordinary income. They could see it all going to Uncle Sam, and they didn't know what to do. They had given me 30 seconds, but when I said yeah, they ran away to think some more, end quote. A few weeks later, Nagley finally agreed to accept the $200,000. But if Ted defaulted on the payment, he would get the company. So Ted asked him, how long have I got? Their response, 90 days. At the time, Ted just had $25,000 cash on hand, so he had to borrow $30,000 from his accountant, Erwin Mazzo, just to cover payroll for Turner Advertising. On top of that, he needed to raise or find or do something to get $200,000 within 90 days in order to get back the company, or else he wouldn't get it. Yes, Nagley's terms were steep, and yes, meeting them was going to take serious determination or street smarts, but if he could raise the money, it was going to be his company again. So, with no capital, or very little capital, and no clear way of raising the money, Ted made a counteroffer. According to Ted, quote, I wound up convincing them that they should take stock in the company so later on they would get a long-term gain. In the end, we didn't even have to pay the $200,000. But boy, I had plenty of other debts. I was only a kid, but I learned how to hustle, end quote. Ladies and gentlemen, that is how Ted Turner got his company back. Now, in what will become a recurring theme this season, Ted's team of advisors, in this case his dad's friends, were furious. They knew his father didn't think he had the business acumen or the finesse or even the maturity to manage or own a company. They were positive that Ted was going to crap out and that they would be left to clean up the mess. And still, Ted pressed on, saying, quote, I went out and convinced the employees to buy stock in the company. I sold off all of our real estate that I possibly could to raise cash. I sold my father's plantation. I borrowed against our accounts receivable. I squeezed the juice out of everything. End quote. If you want any kind of indication about what kind of person Ted Turner was at the time and why he didn't just take the money and walk away and lay on the beach drinking pina coladas, he explained, quote, "My father had worked like hell all his life trying to make the big time. He went as far as he could, and when he dropped the baton, it was for me to pick up. Plus, I am a fighter. I was raised that way. I could never be a dilettante living off the fat of the land. That business was really important to me. I don't know where I'd be without it." End quote. Think about it. Most people don't have a clue what they do in the event of a family member or business partner's untimely death. And their first thought normally isn't about work or killing a deal that their father had made that they disagreed with. But Ted Turner wasn't like most people. Ted's always appeared to operate on gut and instinct. These instincts were shaped by a tough childhood, along with an unshakable confidence from years of intense sailing competitions and studying his heroes in battle. So once Ted got his company back, what did he tell everybody at Turner Advertising? Did he tell them things were going just swell and that cash flow was fine? Of course not. You see, Ted knew how to turn a crisis into an opportunity and rally his troops. The best owners and operators and founders do this all the time. Erwin Mazzo recalled, quote, "Right off, Ted created a sense of paranoia within the company, a sense that we were the little guys fighting for our lives against some unknown big guys. That made everything seem a lot more important than it probably was. After all, we were not doing badly, and Turner Advertising was the biggest billboard company in the South. One of the biggest in the country, actually. He even insisted on making telephone calls to me on outside payphones. Ted wanted people to believe our phones were tapped. Perhaps it would distract them from how well the business was doing. So Ted rushed right into our lenders and bowled them over. More times than not, he came out with new lines of credit he wanted. Loyalty is a big part of Ted. He expects unstinting loyalty from anyone he has to deal with, banks, customers, employees. But he gives that loyalty back in spades, end quote. According to Mazzo, quote, "When Ted took over the business, Turner Advertising was in great shape. No question we owed an awful lot of money, but the cash flow coming in each month was more than enough to cover debt on the acquisitions. I think Ted understood that, even if nobody else did. And as soon as he came to see the light at the end of the tunnel, nothing was ever going to hold him back," end quote. Now, that's a lot, I know. But coming from his family friend and accountant, Erwin Mazzo, this is really high praise. These were the same people who said Ted wasn't ready to run the business. He's 24, he's inexperienced, he's brash. And yet immediately once he gets the company, Ted completely understands the psychological aspect of motivating a team. If everyone thinks things are going as planned and that business is A-okay, then no one would have worked as hard. There'd be less skin in the game as well. Now, it didn't take long for Ted to realize that billboards were a gold mine, especially as a tax-depreciable revenue stream with very little minimal capital needed. He already had essentially a monopoly on outdoor advertising in the South, with plenty of room to grow through mergers and acquisitions. So the bigger the company got, the better its economies of scale became, and the more pricing power they gained with advertisers. And even with legislation looming that might limit the number of billboards on the highway, it was still a great business to be in the mid-1960s. So just how good was Ted at growing his billboard business? Well, family friend and accountant Erwin Mazzo shared his amazement as he, quote, "watched Ted put his father's business in order. He did that with his eyes closed, with plenty of time on the side for sailing. He could have retired any time during those early years and never looked back. But then we started making acquisitions, always trying to use the other person's money. That was Ted's genius. He could charm the pants off anyone when he wanted to. Usually the fellow we would acquire would turn right around and work twice as hard for Ted as he ever had for himself, end quote. These guys that he was buying companies from must have been 10, 20, sometimes double his age. Do you know how hard it is to get someone to work that much harder for a young person? Trust me, these things are not easy to do. It takes smarts, a lot of charm, incentives. But Ted was ready. He was ready for all of it. And once he had control of Turner Advertising, he wasted no time expanding into new markets, acquiring competitors in Knoxville and Chattanooga. Aside from those early sabotage tactics to get his company back, Ted refused to play dirty. His lawyer, Tench Cox, recalled, quote, "A lot of times back then we sort of went to the edge, but Ted never wanted to be involved in anything that wasn't fair game. He will risk a lot, but not his reputation," end quote. That sounds an awful like what Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett say about your reputation being your most important asset, which is so true, especially in these personal businesses, which media and advertising certainly are. Maybe not as much today in terms of the automation aspect of buying advertising, but when an account gets big enough, trust me, it gets negotiated by people. And if you want to have a TV show made in Hollywood, there's no API for that. It's people. Relationships rule the world. They did in 1963, they did in 69, they did in 1980, and they still do today. Through all of this, Ted's tenacity never wavered, saying, quote, "I'd like to point out that we're tenacious. We don't accept marginal locations. We pick the location that we want, and then we keep going back until we get it. In fact, we literally hound the people to death in a nice way. Personally, I've had people throw up their hands after 40 hours with them on 30 calls and go, okay, end quote. The message was clear. You do whatever it takes to get the job done. That was Ted's mentality. By any means necessary. If that requires 30 phone calls over 40 hours with a client, you call them 30 times and you talk to them for 40 hours. You're tenacious. Now, by the late 1960s, Ted Turner was starting to get restless. His billboard business was thriving. It was the largest in the South, one of the biggest 5 in the country, but it no longer excited him. Billboards were steady, reliable, but in Ted's eyes, pretty boring. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life pointing drivers to the next gas station, and who could blame him? So what did he do? He looked for a bigger challenge. You see, that's what the greats do. They're always looking for bigger opportunities and bigger arenas to pry their trade. So Ted decided to expand into another communication medium, one where he'd be able to leverage his expertise in advertising. And radio seemed like the perfect fit. Billboards, but brought to life. You see, unlike Ted's father, Ted didn't mind the risk. In fact, he welcomed it. His appetite for risk wasn't some appetite for destruction. No, it was calculated, but it might have seemed that way to most. I mean, I'm talking about a future world champion sailor here, who at the time was one of the most outrageous, competitive, relentless sons of bitches in the entire world, both on the seas and highways. Ted was ready to take on new challenges, but in order to achieve real greatness, like a lot of his heroes, he knew he needed to take much bigger swings. Swings that would be impossible in billboards. So in 1968, Ted Turner bought WAPO, a radio station in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In acquiring WAPO, he learned a valuable lesson. You see, Ted didn't want to seem too eager when he tried to buy the failing radio station, so he told the owners he'd need a little more time to think it over. During that time to think it over, new bidders entered the picture and almost cost Ted the deal. He eventually landed his radio station prize, but he overpaid for the station by more than $300,000. His business partner, Jim Roddy, later said, quote, "We ended up buying the worst radio station in the country, and we still overpaid," end quote. There are some people who say it's fine to overpay, but I'm pretty sure if you buy the worst radio station in the country, it's not a good thing. As this season unfolds, you're going to see that as Ted Turner's ambitions grow and the stakes keep getting higher and higher, he may have taken the wrong lesson from this experience of waiting and then overpaying. From now on, Ted moves faster and faster in each M&A deal, often closing them the same day. Due diligence, reading contracts, forget about it. Now, I'm no genius, but I can tell you that this is not a good strategy. In fact, it's one that will eventually catch up with Ted in the late 1980s. But we're not talking about the 1980s right now. We're talking about the late 1960s. And part of Ted's strategy with WAPO in order to turn it around focused on two key items. First, he switched the station's format to top 40 radio. Then, he used his empty billboards across the South to promote the radio station. He explained, quote, "When we got to Chattanooga, it had no format whatsoever. Zero format. I mean, breakfast time, there were these two people who said good morning to each other, and then there was nothing else to say. Really. The manager loved golf. You ever hear of a radio station covering golf? This station, I mean, his radio covered golf. Live. On radio." End quote. Ted's billboards were already generating consistent profits, but there was advertiser turnover per usual. So a lot of times that would leave a lot of them empty. And through this empty billboard situation, Ted saw an opportunity. Why not use those empty billboards to promote his radio station? Now that's an easy win-win. These are the kinds of things that the people at the networks never had to think about because they already had distribution locked down. This is my second podcast for High Bar, but when we launched our first, which is called You Had to Be There, it can get a little overwhelming when you think you're up against a million other podcasts and they're all free. How do you get distribution? How do you get awareness? Where do you go for more reach? The big three networks never once had to think about that. They were on every television, and there were three of them. Even though each of them had very similar programming, which if you don't like ABC, you could just turn it to CBS. If you don't like what's on CBS, you can turn it to NBC. With radio, there were tons more radio stations than television stations. So using empty billboards was an automatic win. Now, if someone else at a radio station owned a billboard company, that would be a big win too, but they didn't. My guess is it would have been locked in layers of bureaucracy, but Ted made every decision. If someone came to him with a great idea, he'd say, "Oh, let's just do it." Okay? So it was an easy win-win. Now, when it came to location, Ted said, quote, "One reason I wanted the station in Chattanooga so much was that I owned the billboards there. See, I could take my vacant signs and promote my radio station. One of the things that was wrong with the billboard business was that although we had a 35% profit, we would also have 25% of our signs not being used. It seemed like an awful waste to have any unsold signs because you have to do the upkeep on them anyway. It's not like a newspaper where if you don't get the ads, you can cut the number of pages. So I would put up my own radio ads on the open billboards. It doesn't sound too brilliant, but it worked. I got the idea from an oil refinery. It had an open flame on top. That heat was being lost uselessly. And I wondered, why didn't they put it under a cooker and make oil with it? It's fire. At least put it under a coffee pot. That bothered the hell out of me, believe it or not. That little wasted flame. You really have to be dumb to waste your resources because you've only got so much. End quote. Even Ted's business partner, Jim Roddy, remembered him saying, quote, "I know it doesn't sound very brilliant, but it's sure gonna work." End quote. Ted's radio strategy with WAPO did work. It worked brilliantly. Soon after, Ted bought 3 more radio stations in markets like Jacksonville and Charleston, all running the same playbook. New format, billboards, repeat. In short order, Ted's Chattanooga station went from last place to first in the area. This was just the first step in his grand plan when he bought WAPO. You see, his ultimate vision was to create a network of radio stations capable of broadcasting his advertising nationwide. What Ted didn't realize was this. His grand vision of a nationwide radio network wasn't new. In fact, NBC's David Sarnoff beat him to it by more than 40 years. And replicating Sarnoff's success on radio was going to be nearly impossible. Now, fortunately for Ted and for our podcast, radio didn't excite him as much as he had hoped. You see, it turned out to be a total pain in the ass, and building a radio network in 1969 was a losing battle. In fact, it would be a losing war. Not only was there a ton of competition, think about how many radio stations there are on a dial, but there wasn't enough airtime for ads. The truth was that barriers to entry were too low. Centralizing operations was nearly impossible. Geography was a logistical nightmare, and scaling the business would have been insanely expensive. Ted even joked that drugged out DJs were a huge problem, which, when you think about it, makes a lot of sense. It's the late 60s, Summer of Love, time of Sgt. Pepper, The Lower Haight, Woodstock. People playing that music aren't going to be on the straight and narrow, are they? No, they're partaking. Flaws aside, radio could still be a very profitable business for the right operator. But it just wasn't that exciting to Ted Turner. Within 2 years of buying 5 radio stations, Ted sensed that the winds of media were shifting. By the end of 1969, those same winds brought a stockbroker to his office with an offer, the opportunity to buy a rundown, independent TV station in Atlanta, Georgia. To everyone, this TV station was DOA, dead on arrival. But to Ted Turner, it was El Dorado. The thing was, Ted Turner knew absolutely nothing about television. Thanks for listening to the first episode of Media Moguls. This one I think of as both a first episode, but also a prologue for the rest of the show. In the next episode of Media Moguls, we're going to go to the beginning days of the cable industry, how it started and grew. Then we're going to go to early 1970s Atlanta, Georgia, where a young entrepreneur with absolutely no TV experience scrapped and fought for relevance in the minds of Atlantans and on their television dial. Trust me when I say, it's one of the most incredible stories of defying the odds and quieting the naysayers that you're ever going to hear. We'll take on all competitors, turn old assets into new, and change television forever. Ted Turner's cable dream and superstation awaits. Until next time, I'm Web Barr, and this is Media Moguls, the Ted Turner Saga.